using this New Century version today because it speaks bold and plain, just like I'm sure James did in his day. Chapter 2, verse 1. My dear brothers and sisters, as believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, never think some people are more important than others. Suppose someone comes into your church meeting wearing nice clothes and a gold ring. At the same time, a poor person comes in wearing old, dirty clothes. You show special attention to the one wearing nice clothes and say, please, sit here in this good seat. But you say to the poor person, stand over there, or sit on the floor in front of my feet. What are you doing? You are making some people more important than others, and with evil thoughts, you are deciding that one person is better. Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, God chose the poor in the world to be rich in faith, and the kingdom, and to receive the kingdom God promised to those who love Him. But you show no respect to the poor. The rich are always trying to control your lives. They are the ones who take you to court, and they are the ones who speak against Jesus, who owns you. This royal law is found in the Scriptures. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you obey this law, you are doing right. But if you treat one person as being more important than another, you are sinning. You are guilty of breaking God's law. A person who follows all of God's law but fails to obey even one command is guilty of breaking all the commands in that law. In verse 14 through 17, my brothers and sisters, if people say they have faith but do nothing, their faith is worth nothing. Can faith like that save them? A brother or sister in Christ might need clothes or food. If you say to that person, God be with you, I hope you stay warm and get plenty to eat, but you do not give what that person needs, your words are worth nothing. In the same way, faith by itself does nothing. It is dead. May God add a blessing to the reading and understanding of His Word today. You know, on this Labor Day, how neat is it to be talking about a guy who was just nothing but a blue-collar kind of guy. This James, he was preaching in Jerusalem, and I'm sure he had callous knees and got down into people's faces when he needed to. Prejudice, that's what he's talking about here. Whether it's a mongrel dog, a pedigree cat, a rich person, a poor person, young or old, it's not a pretty sight. It's also not acceptable. Not an acceptable trait for ones who claim to be Christians. In the language of the Bible, my friend James here would have called it having respect for people. Not like Aretha Franklin, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. We're not talking about that 60s hit. We're talking about favoritism, special treatment. It's a cousin to that prejudice. Tell me, folks, what do you think when something happens like this? A qualified woman's passed over for promotion in favor of a man, seemingly because it's always been a man's position. What about a person of color and a white person begin dating? What about when you're in the checkout line at the supermarket and the person ahead of you pays for groceries with their food stamp card? What about if a South American immigrant looking for work brings his family, decides to migrate north and move into the house next door to you? This morning we're going to talk about James' helpful, practical letter of advice to the followers here. His problems he had with prejudice and favoritism. See, reading the passage is simple enough. A church service is in progress. Two people come in. One guy's the winner, one guy's the loser. Who gets the attention? See, evidently in Jerusalem, in this church pastored by James, they were having problems. They didn't understand that catering to the rich and powerful while neglecting the needy was wrong. And here's why it's wrong. Here's what the Lord tells us. It changed the poor. There were not many chairs in the synagogue to offer everyone a chair with a footstool. It was a high honor. But to make someone sit on the floor in a footstool was a slap in the face. To consider that person of lesser value. And how inappropriate that was in that setting for gatherers who claim to be people for Jesus. Jesus didn't consider any of us to be of little value, did He? No. He even sat in the treasury one day, and when a widow came in and put her 2 mites in with those smaller, lighter coins, they made a distinctive sound, very different from the distinct sound of those heavy coins the rich man put in. See, even their method of tithing and offering was allow them to brag and for the poor to remain in their place. We say, I don't know, that's probably not going on today. Folks, it still goes on. Pastor Ken Rule once served on a credentials committee for Association of Churches. And part of his job, his affiliation with that group, was he had to attend a worship service and then meet with the pastor. And he walked into the service in his church one day to do just that, and there was a white man. He was the only white man there. And that didn't bother him. They sang, they conducted worship much different than some of us do and we're accustomed to. And that didn't bother him either. He said he was sure that Paul and Silas probably sung Victory in Jesus in jail themselves. But when it came to the offering, he was directed to the insert in the bulletin. One side listed every dime that was given or not given by every member. On the other side was the statistical data keeping track of who gave. We say, boy, that's extremely crass, don't we? But we have our ways. We do have our ways of doing things. A thing that happened in that church was it led others astray because it called attention to people's wealth or their lack of wealth. And it's a detriment. Because Jesus told us we'd always have poor and we must minister to the poor. Churches need to help the needy. You know, even today, there's you watch on TV, you'll see preachers of prosperity theology. And they're real good. They'll inform you that, you know, you should be healthy and rich and wise. And it'll always help if you send them $100, you know, help your garden out a little bit, you know, help your seed garden. That theology says that you're woefully deficient if you're poor. Somewhat of us, sometimes we experience some of that stuff. But here's one thing we know. Often the poor walk in faith a whole lot more than any of us who have money in the bank. They're not busted in faith. They're just busted in the pocketbook. Calling attention to it will divide you. In the early days, Peter went down to the Galatians believers. Even though they were Gentiles and he was a Jew, you know, they normally considered Jews to be lesser than kind of human, you know. And they were a little uppity, those Jews were in the early days. And Peter found a great revival going on. He stayed there for the fellowship. He joined in on the party and he celebrated with them. He was having a good time. But when the church folks from back home in Jerusalem came down with a delegation, suddenly his Jewish bones kicked back in and he withdrew from that fellowship. You see, Peter, as we know in history, Peter was a flip-flopper. Every time he was on one side, and then when somebody would get in his face, he kind of got on the other side for a little bit. He needed the Lord to kind of bring him back every once in a while. He had a problem with that. We can't play favorites. One of the things I heard, the stories I heard this week, was a pastor serving in a small church when he first started down in Florida in his ministry. And he went in, and one of his parishioners at that church was a Florida legend. He'd been the speaker of the Florida Senate in the 50s. That church only had 60 or 70 members, but man, that guy was a legend there. And when the pastor and his wife came to the church, they were told by one member, who happened to be the legend's secretary, they told him, Mrs. Legend likes those azaleas to grow high around the old twin oaks at the parsonage, so don't cut them too low. And he said he found out at that church that everything at that church couldn't be done unless Mrs. Legend was consulted. And, you know, some folks kind of resented that a little bit. The preacher said he didn't even like azaleas to begin with. A year or so after that, he found out that Mrs. Legend, who was running a lot of things at the church, wasn't even a member of that church. She was a member of another faith. It kind of leads us to a hideous point about the problem of favoritism. Favoritism is known today by a lot simpler term. It's not quite as pretty as favoritism. Kids call it sucking up. I've heard that in the classroom. Some kid comes up to you to ask you something or get a special favor, and the first thing the kid says, why is she sucking up to the teacher? That's showing favoritism. It shames the poor, leads others astray, divides the body. It's just plain wrong. In the Gospel of Matthew, I talked about this a few weeks ago. A young politician came to Jesus, a mover and a shaker, and he wanted to inherit eternal life. And he said to Jesus, I've done a good job. What else do I have to do but obey the commandments? And Jesus told him, you lack one thing, son. Give everything you own, come follow me. That'll do it. But we know what Matthew wrote down there. Matthew wrote down that the rich young politician hung his head and he just simply walked away. Onlookers said, boy, that believer. He asked the right questions. He's wealthy, socially, politically corrected. And Jesus looked him in the eye. Here's what he said to him. It means too much to you, being rich and powerful, and having people suck up to you. It means more to you than being obedient to God. Is it possible for a believer to act like that? That's the problem with favoritism, prejudice, and selfishness. So what does the Lord tell us to do? He says, as James said right here, verse 2, the royal law of love. If you keep the royal law found in the Scriptures, love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing the right thing. That law runs all through the Scriptures, back even in Proverbs. Proverbs 22:1 says, a good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver and gold. Translation, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. And loving favor of God is better than silver and gold. Verse 2 it says, rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is maker of them all. Translation, the rich and the poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. Leviticus 19:15 says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly.